Hello world, thanks for joining me again. Today we're going to be installing VirtualBox and Ubuntu in VirtualBox. So the files that we've downloaded in the first video, one of them is the actual VirtualBox installer, and then we also have the Ubuntu ISO or disk image. So we're going to start by running VirtualBox installer as administrator. Now the installation of this is pretty straightforward. It doesn't really require you to configure anything. So once it comes up, just hit next, 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 yes, and then install. And once this installs, you'll see how we are able to create virtual machines or virtual computers that we can run on our host Windows operating system. And the virtual machines will have their own virtual disk image, which is basically like a hard drive. So we can create that, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. So once the installer finishes, we're going to leave that checked because we want to start the VirtualBox immediately. So just hit finish, and it should start up here, right there. So this is a VirtualBox. It's a very clean and simple interface. You've got a menu bar up here, which you'll probably never touch. And then you've also got a toolbar with icons here. So to get started, we're going to hit New to create a new virtual machine, and I'm going to name it Ubuntu. The type is Linux, and the version is going to be, it should default to Ubuntu 64-bit, which is great because we've got a 64-bit disk image to use. So click Next, and here we're going to allot it a certain amount of our actual RAM to use on the virtual machine. You can set this to whatever you like. Typically, you don't want to go into this orange or pink field because that's going to give you less RAM on your host machine. So I typically like to set it to about half of my total RAM, which is 4096 megabytes, 4 gigabytes. Once you've got this set, just hit next, and we're going to create a virtual disk now. We're going to be using the VDI or VirtualBox Disk Image format, so just hit next. The difference between dynamically allocated and fixed size is that in a moment we're going to be able to choose a target size for the VirtualBox disk image. With a fixed size, that's always going to be the same. So it's always, if we set it to 20 gigabytes, that's always going to consume exactly 20 gigabytes on our host hard drive as a file. If we dynamically allocate it, what that means is that we can set the target size to 20 gigabytes, but if there's only like 5 gigabytes of actual data on that virtual drive, it's only going to consume that 5 gigabytes on our host drive as a file. So dynamically allocated is always what I use. It just seems better. So hit next, and here is where we are able to choose the target size of the hard drive. So I'm going to choose 20 gigabytes. Hit create, and here is our virtual machine. We have an option to start it right now, which is going to be useless because we haven't yet told it what type of installation media we want to use. So select the VirtualBox in the left-hand menu and hit Settings. When the settings comes up, there's not much we need to really do here. If we go to System, we need to make sure Enable I/O APIC is on. Hardware clock and UTC time should be defaulted as well. If we go to the processor tab, we see that it's using 1 core of my quad core processor. Now we can increase this, but I find you get worse performance the more cores you use. So we're not going to do that. Acceleration should always be enabled. If you have trouble with this and you're on Windows 10, you've actually got to do something else. So if I go into Programs and Features by right-clicking on the Start menu icon, Then go to turn Windows features on or off. Now, here's an interesting thing. Hypervisor is a virtualization technology that Windows includes by default. I'm not sure if it's pre-configured to use. If it's checked, that means it is. If it's unchecked, it means it's not. So if you have trouble with setting up a virtual machine, basically what you're going to want to do is first of all, come in here and make sure this is disabled. So make sure it's unchecked. If it's checked, uncheck it. It's going to prompt you to restart. Once that's configured, you've got to actually go into your BIOS and you've got to enable virtualization technology for your processor. So to boot into the BIOS, you're going to restart your computer normally, and as soon as it comes back on, before you see the Windows logo or anything like that, you're going to repeatedly strike the key. It's normally F10. Your motherboard might have a different key that it uses to get into BIOS. Sometimes it's F2. So just try that, and once you get into the BIOS, follow these images and you should have no trouble at all. So back to the VirtualBox. If we go to display, we're going to see that the video memory is set really low at 12 megabytes. That's not going to really help much. So what we're going to do is put that up all the way to the end, which is 128 megabytes. It should give better performance, and we're going to enable 3D acceleration. 2D acceleration is only available on Windows guest machines, so that's irrelevant at this point. If we come down to the storage item, this is what we need to use to tell the virtual image to load up our Ubuntu ISO. So select the empty disk here, and on the right hand side you'll see this icon here. I've already pre-selected it in a previous run, but what you're going to do is click Choose Virtual Optical Disk File, and then browse to where you saved the ISO. Select it and hit Open. Now this tells the virtual machine that we want to use this ISO to boot off of and to install the system. We don't really need to go through anything else, so just hit OK. And now we can start the virtual machine.